as the helicopter's rotors cut through the icy expanse of the glacier. Vast, white desolation stretched endlessly beneath the team, an unyielding canvas of cold and silence. Dr. Andrew Bennett, the expedition leader, sat near the window, his jaw clenched as he surveyed the landscape below. This was his fourth Arctic expedition, but the crushing sense of responsibility weighed on him more than ever. Beside him, Emma Carter, the young, ambitious scientist, leaned forward in her seat, her eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. "Do you realize," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine, "what this could mean? An ancient, preserved body like this could change everything we know about human history." Andrew glanced at her, offering a tight smile. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to confirm the site's stability first. The glacier's more treacherous than it looks." The others remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Noah Grant, the technician, was meticulously checking his equipment, a furrow of concern etched into his forehead. He had already dealt with several glitches in the comm system, a bad omen for a place so remote. Then there was Tasha Ortiz, the historian and photographer, who clutched a leather-bound notebook filled with sketches of ancient symbols. Her fascination with local myths had made her invaluable to the team, though her quiet intensity sometimes unnerved the others. Finally, Jacob Iverson, their local guide, sat with a grim expression. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something. When the helicopter touched down, the cold was immediate and unrelenting. It clawed at their faces and seeped through their layers of clothing. As the team unloaded their gear, Jacob muttered something in his native tongue. Andrew caught the tone of warning. "What did you say?" Andrew asked, adjusting his scarf. Jacob hesitated, then spoke louder. "This place is called Shellifanger, Soul Catcher. The legends say the ice here is alive, and it remembers. We should tread carefully." Emma rolled her eyes. "Superstitions don't freeze artifacts for millennia, Jacob." Jacob didn't respond. Instead, he pointed toward the faint outline of their base camp in the distance, a scattering of orange tents barely visible against the white void. "Let's get inside before the storm comes." The trek to the camp was grueling. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the wind seemed to grow louder with each step. By the time they arrived, the team was exhausted. The base camp was a fragile haven, its thin walls vibrating under the relentless gusts of wind. Inside, the air was slightly warmer, but the sense of isolation pressed down on them all. Andrew called for a quick meeting. The group huddled around a portable heater, their breath visible in the dim light. "Tomorrow, we start the excavation," he said. "We'll stick to the plan. Emma and Tasha will document the find, Noah will monitor the equipment, and Jacob and I will ensure the site is secure." "What about the body?" Emma asked eagerly. "Shouldn't we bring it back to camp for study?" Andrew hesitated. "We'll assess the condition first. No decisions." Later that night, as the others slept, Andrew stayed awake, poring over maps and weather reports. The wind outside had taken on an unnatural cadence, almost like whispering voices. He shook his head, blaming exhaustion, but he couldn't shake a growing unease. Meanwhile, Tasha lay in her tent, unable to sleep. She turned on her flashlight and flipped through her notebook, tracing the symbols she had drawn. One in particular stood out, a jagged spiral surrounded by claw-like marks. It was a glyph she'd seen in the legends Jacob had mentioned, associated with entrapment and sacrifice. She shivered and snapped the notebook shut. In the distance, the glacier groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo through the camp. It was the ice shifting, Andrew reassured himself. Just the ice. But outside, the frozen landscape seemed to breathe, its surface shimmering faintly under the pale light of the moon. Unseen by the team, a faint crack had formed where they would begin their excavation. It spread slowly, like a vein through the ice, reaching toward the surface where something ancient waited. Tomorrow, the descent would begin. Morning arrived in a pale, reluctant glow, the sun barely piercing through the overcast sky. The biting wind had subsided, but a bone-deep chill lingered in the air. The team gathered around the excavation site, their breaths clouding the air as Andrew gave final instructions. "Stay within sight of the camp," Andrew warned. "Jacob, keep watch for any instability in the ice." Jacob nodded but said nothing. He kept a hand near the ice axe on his belt, his eyes scanning the horizon. The body was first discovered weeks earlier by a satellite survey, its shape captured in the dense ice. Emma and Noah worked in tandem to set up the laser cutters, the faint hum of the equipment the only sound in the vast silence. Tasha stood nearby, her camera poised, capturing every detail as they began to cut through the layers. "This is incredible," Emma whispered, her voice tinged with awe as the first glimpses of the body came into view. Encased in ice, the figure was hauntingly well-preserved. A man, dressed in ancient fur-lined garments, his frozen face twisted in an expression of raw terror. His eyes, eerily intact, seemed to stare right at them. "He looks afraid," Tasha said, lowering her camera. "Like he saw something just before he died." Andrew stepped forward, his gloved hand brushing against the translucent ice. "Or like he was trying to escape," he said, pointing to the claw-like marks around the body. The man's fingers were splayed, as though grasping for freedom. The ice directly beneath him had faint scratches, almost as if he'd been trying to claw his way out. "Scratch marks don't make themselves," Noah muttered, adjusting the sensors monitoring the surrounding temperature. "This ice is strange. It's holding colder than it should, almost unnaturally so." Jacob stiffened. "We should stop." Emma turned to him, exasperated. "We're scientists, Jacob. We don't stop because of a feeling." "This is not science," Jacob said sharply, his voice low but forceful. "This is something else." Tasha crouched down to get a closer shot of the glyph carved near the body. It was identical to the one in her notebook, the jagged spiral surrounded by claw marks. Her fingers trembled as she traced it in the ice. "This symbol," she murmured. "It's a ward, a warning." Andrew frowned. "You're saying someone sealed this body in here intentionally?" Tasha nodded, her voice almost a whisper. "To keep something in?" Before Andrew could respond, a sudden crack echoed through the glacier. The sound was deep and resonant, like a groan of pain. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the ice beneath their feet. "It's just the glacier shifting," Noah said, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Right?" Jacob's hand tightened on his axe. "No." The body was finally freed, suspended between layers of ice. The team worked quickly to extract it, but as they did, Emma noticed something. Frost patterns had begun to spread unnaturally fast across the clear walls of the excavation site, forming intricate, almost organic shapes. They resembled faces, twisted, anguished faces. "Andrew," Emma's voice wavered as she pointed. "What is that?" He followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. The frost patterns were moving. Slowly, deliberately, they inched closer to the body, as if drawn to it. "Get back to camp," Andrew ordered. "Now!" As the team scrambled to pack up their gear, the glacier groaned again, louder this time. A fissure split the ice near the body, and for a fleeting moment, it looked as if the frozen man's eyes shifted, locking onto Andrew's. A violent gust of wind howled through the camp, sending snow and ice spiraling into the air. It was deafening, drowning out the team's shouts as they stumbled back toward the tents. The wind seemed alive, circling them like a predator. Inside the safety of the main tent, Andrew tried to steady his breathing. "We're suspending the excavation," he said. "We need to regroup and figure out what we're dealing with." Emma looked at him in disbelief. "You saw it. That body is a treasure trove of knowledge. We can't just leave it." Jacob interjected, his voice icy. "You don't understand. The legends say this glacier is a prison. That body is not just a man. It's the lock. And you think we just unlocked it?" Tasha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob's silence was answer enough. That night, the camp was eerily quiet. The team huddled together, the glow of their lanterns the only barrier against the encroaching darkness. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it faint whispers, words that sounded almost human. Tasha sat apart, flipping through her notebook, searching for anything she might have missed. As she turned the pages, frost began to form on the edges of the paper. She shivered and looked up. The corner of the tent nearest her was covered in frost, the cold seeping inward like a living thing. And then she heard it, a low, guttural voice, faint but distinct, calling her name. Tasha. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the frozen corner, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The frost began to spread faster, snaking toward her feet. Tasha, it was coming from outside. The whispering persisted, faint but undeniable. Tasha stared at the frost creeping across the floor of the tent. It curled and twisted like fingers reaching for her boots. Tasha. The voice was low and gravelly, but it carried an unnatural cadence. It sounded close, impossibly close. She held her breath, willing herself to believe it was a trick of the wind. But then it came again, more insistent. Tasha, come outside. She dropped her notebook and scrambled toward the others huddled near the heater. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice trembling. Andrew turned, concern etched across his face. Hear what? Something is outside, she whispered, her eyes darting toward the tent flap. The wind chose that moment to howl violently, the fabric of the tent buckling under the force. Andrew grabbed a flashlight and exchanged a wary look with Jacob, who was already on his feet, his ice axe in hand. We'll check it out, Andrew said. The rest of you, stay here. No, don't go, Tasha pleaded. It knows my name. Emma scoffed, though her voice was edged with nervousness. You've been listening to Jacob's ghost stories too much. Jacob shot her a cold glare before nodding to Andrew. Together, they stepped outside into the frigid darkness. The storm had worsened. Snow whipped around them in chaotic spirals, and visibility was reduced to just a few feet. Andrew shone his flashlight into the swirling white, the beam cutting through the darkness, but revealing nothing. Do you see anything? He shouted over the wind. Jacob pointed toward the excavation site, where a faint, bluish glow emanated from the ice. There! Andrew hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But his sense of duty, his need to protect his team, overrode his fear. Slowly, they trudged toward the light. The body was still there, lying atop the ice where they had left it. But now it looked different. The face, once frozen in terror, seemed more composed. The eyes, still open, glistened unnaturally, reflecting the eerie glow that now surrounded it. Frost patterns radiated outward from the body, forming spirals and jagged symbols that Jacob recognized immediately. It's the sigil, Jacob whispered, his voice almost lost in the wind. The one Tasha drew. Andrew crouched beside the body, his breath forming a cloud in the freezing air. What the hell is happening here? As if in answer, the ice beneath their feet trembled. A loud crack split the air, and both men stumbled backward as a fissure opened in the glacier. The bluish glow intensified, and for a fleeting moment, Andrew thought he saw shadows, tall, humanoid figures, moving within the icy depths. Jacob grabbed his arm. We need to leave. Now! Andrew didn't argue. They turned and bolted back to the camp, the storm clawing at them with every step. Behind them, the glow from the excavation site pulsed brighter, casting long, distorted shadows across the snow. Inside the tent, the others waited in tense silence. The heater crackled faintly, but the cold had become unbearable. Emma paced restlessly while Noah tinkered with a malfunctioning radio. Tasha sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze fixed on the tent flap. She could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent. They've been gone too long, she said finally. Before anyone could respond, the flap burst open, and Andrew and Jacob stumbled inside, their faces pale and drawn. Andrew was shaking as he relayed what they'd seen. It's not just a body, he said, his voice trembling. There's something under the ice, something alive. Jacob cut in, his tone grim. The sigils were a warning. We've disturbed it. Emma scoffed, though her bravado was cracking. Disturbed what? Exactly? An ancient boogeyman? Come on, you're talking like... Her words were cut off by a sudden, deafening roar. The sound reverberated through the camp, shaking the ground and causing their lanterns to flicker. It was a guttural, unearthly noise that seemed to come from deep within the glacier. Noah's eyes widened as the radio in his hand sprang to life, emitting a burst of static. Amid the noise, a voice crackled through, faint but clear. "Return it or be consumed." Everyone froze. "Well, what was that?" Emma stammered. "It's awake," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And it's angry." The tent's walls began to bulge inward, as though something massive was pressing against them. Frost crawled across the fabric, and the temperature plummeted even further. The roaring outside grew louder, and through the thin walls, they could see shadows moving, tall, indistinct figures circling the camp. Andrew grabbed the radio and shouted into it. "Who is this? What do you mean, return it?" The only response was static, followed by a low, chilling laugh that made their blood run cold. "Andrew, what do we do?" Tasha asked, her voice breaking. He hesitated, his mind racing. The body. It had to be the key. If they return it to the ice, maybe, just maybe, they could undo whatever they had unleashed. "Grab her gear," he said finally. "We're taking it back." Jacob shook his head. "It's too late. The ice won't let us leave." As if to confirm his words, the roaring outside intensified, and the shadows grew closer. Frost now coated the interior of the tent, and the air was so cold it burned their lungs. Andrew clenched his jaw. "We have to try." But as he reached for the tent flap, a hand, cold, impossibly strong, gripped his wrist from the other side. A voice, low and guttural, whispered through the howling wind, "You cannot escape." The grip on Andrew's wrist was icy, burning through his glove and searing his skin. He yanked his arm back instinctively, stumbling into the others. The tent flap hung open, flapping wildly in the storm. Outside, the swirling snow revealed fleeting glimpses of tall, shadowy figures encircling the camp. "Did you see that?" Andrew gasped, clutching his wrist. A frostbitten imprint, like clawed fingers, marred his skin. Jacob stepped forward, his axe in hand, his face grim. "They're closing in. We're trapped," Emma whispered, backing away from the tent opening. Her usual confidence had crumbled, replaced by raw fear. Noah's voice cracked as he tried to focus on the malfunctioning radio. "If we can get a signal out, maybe someone can help us." Tasha crouched in the corner, her notebook clutched to her chest. Her lips moved silently, as if reciting something. Andrew knelt beside her. "Tasha, what are you saying?" Her eyes darted to his, wide and unfocused. "The sigils," she murmured. "They're more than warnings. They're instructions. It's a ritual." "What kind of ritual?" Andrew pressed. Tasha's voice trembled. "To seal it again. To trap whatever's trying to get out." The storm outside grew fiercer, the howling wind carrying strange, distorted sounds, moans, screams, and guttural growls. The shadows beyond the camp loomed larger, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. Jacob peered through the tent flap, his axe raised. "They're not human." Emma paced frantically. "We need to leave. Screw the body. Screw the research. We'll die out here if we don't." A sharp crack interrupted her. The ground beneath them shifted, the ice groaning as though it were alive. They barely had time to react before a jagged fissure tore through the camp, splitting one of the smaller tents in half. "We're not going anywhere," Noah muttered, his face pale. The glacier's breaking apart. Andrew forced himself to focus. "Tasha, can we do this ritual? Can we reseal it?" She hesitated, flipping through her notebook with trembling hands. "I don't know. The glyphs, they have to be recreated. But I don't know what they all mean. And the ritual, it requires a sacrifice." The word hung heavy in the air, silencing the group. Emma shook her head violently. "No, no way. It might be the only way," Jacob said solemnly. "If we don't stop this, none of us will leave this glacier alive." The body lay in the main tent, its frozen form glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Frost patterns continued to spread outward from it, the jagged spirals now resembling twisted vines. Andrew stared at the preserved face, the terror etched into it, and felt a pang of dread. "We start with the glyphs," he said finally. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." Tasha nodded, though her hands shook as she began sketching the symbols from her notebook into the frost-covered snow around the body. Jacob assisted, his stoic demeanor masking his own growing fear. Noah reluctantly abandoned the useless radio and helped trace the intricate lines. The air inside the tent grew colder, each breath forming dense clouds. The frost on the walls thickened, and strange shadows danced along the fabric, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. Emma stood apart, her arms crossed tightly. "This is insane. We don't even know if it'll work." "It's the only option," Andrew snapped. "Unless you got a better idea." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the body as if it might move at any moment. As they worked, the tent grew unnaturally quiet. The howling wind outside faded to a low hum, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on them. The team exchanged uneasy glances. Then the first sound came, a sharp metallic ping, like ice cracking under immense pressure. It was followed by a deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from the body itself. "The ice," Jacob whispered. "It's waking up." The glyphs were nearly complete when Tasha stopped abruptly, staring at her notebook with wide eyes. "There's a part missing," she said, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean missing?" Andrew asked. "The final sigil," she stammered. "It's not in my notes. Without it, the ritual won't work." "Then where is it?" Noah demanded, his voice rising with panic. Before she could answer, the ground beneath them shuddered violently, throwing everyone off balance. The tent collapsed inward, its supports snapping like twigs. The lanterns flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The chaos was immediate. The team scrambled to free themselves from the collapsed fabric as the storm outside surged back to life. Shadows moved closer, their forms now clearer, tall, elongated figures with hollow, glowing eyes. Andrew clawed his way out of the wreckage, the freezing wind biting at his face. He spotted the body lying exposed in the snow, its faint glow now pulsing rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Jacob emerged beside him, his axe at the ready. "The final sigil," he said, his voice grim. "It's on the body." Andrew's stomach sank. "How do you know?" Jacob gestured toward the glowing patterns spreading from the corpse. Amid the spirals and claw marks, a faint, incomplete symbol pulsed on the chest of the frozen man. "We'll have to carve it," Jacob said. Andrew's mind raced. "You mean cut it into the ice?" Jacob nodded. "If we don't, this thing will consume everything." Andrew turned to call for the others, but a piercing scream cut through the storm. He spun around just in time to see one of the shadowy figures dragging Emma into the darkness. "Emma!" he shouted, but she was gone, her screams swallowed by the wind. The remaining team members stood frozen in fear, the enormity of their situation sinking in. Andrew clenched his fists, his voice steady but firm. "We finished the ritual," he said, "or we all die here." The storm raged on as the remaining team members gathered around the glowing body. Fear had tightened its grip on all of them, but the urgency of survival forced them into action. Andrew crouched beside the corpse, his breath clouding the icy air. The incomplete sigil on the frozen chest seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. "We carved the symbol," Andrew said, glancing at Jacob. "If it works, we end this." Jacob nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped his ice axe. "It has to be precise. If we get it wrong..." "We won't get it wrong," Andrew snapped, more to convince himself than anyone else. A cold calculus. Tasha, shivering uncontrollably, flipped through her notebook, trying to decipher the missing sigil. Frost had formed on the pages, making them slick and difficult to read. I think I can approximate it. But if it's incomplete or incorrect, we don't have time to second guess." Andrew barked. "Just show us." Tasha hesitated before sketching the rough outline of the final sigil in the snow. It was complex, a maze of intersecting lines and spirals that seemed to writhe like living things. Andrew nodded grimly and began tracing it onto the corpse's chest with a knife. The ancient ice resisted, but as the blade scratched deeper, the glowing light intensified, radiating outward in rhythmic pulses. As Andrew worked, the air around them thickened. The storm seemed to quiet, replaced by a suffocating stillness. The shadowy figures had stopped moving, standing sentinel at the edge of the camp, their glowing, hollow eyes fixed on the team, unblinking. Emma's fate. A sudden, blood-curdling scream shattered the stillness. It was Emma. Andrew froze, his blade hovering above the last stroke of the sigil. The scream came again, this time closer, raw with agony. Jacob turned toward the sound, his axe ready. "We can't leave her," Tasha cried, tears streaming down her face. Jacob's voice was steady but cold. "If we don't finish this, none of us will survive." Noah, trembling with rage and fear, stood abruptly. "You're just going to let her die?" Andrew's voice cracked as he replied, "If we go after her now, we risk everything. She wouldn't want us to die for nothing." Another scream cut through the night, followed by silence so complete it was deafening. Tasha choked back a sob, but she forced herself to focus on the notebook, her fingers shaking as she pointed to the last detail of the sigil. The final sigil. As Andrew made the final cut into the ice, the corpse beneath him shuddered. He recoiled, the knife slipping from his hand. The frozen man's eyes, which had stared lifelessly for centuries, now glowed with an unnatural light. Frost spiraled outward from the body, forming jagged patterns in the snow that mirrored the glyphs. "It's responding," Tasha whispered, though her voice was edged with dread. The air around them grew heavy, vibrating with an unearthly energy. The shadowy figures began to move again, their jerky motions becoming more deliberate. They stepped closer, forming a circle around the team and the glowing body. Jacob stepped forward, planting himself between the group and the encroaching shadows. "It's not enough," he said, his voice grim. "It still demands the sacrifice." Andrew turned to him, his stomach sinking. "How do you know?" Jacob gestured toward the shadows. "They're waiting. They won't stop unless we complete the ritual." A harrowing choice. The realization hit them like a blow. Someone had to die to seal the glacier's curse. The air grew taut with tension as each person avoided the other's gaze. "No," Noah said, backing away. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Jacob said bluntly. He gripped his ice axe and stared at the glowing body. "I'll do it," Tasha gasped. "You can't." "Jacob, we can find another." "We don't have time," he snapped. "I've known this place was cursed since we arrived. I should never have brought you here. This is on me." Andrew grabbed his arm. "Jacob, wait. We can." Jacob shook him off and stepped toward the body. "You're the leader, Andrew. If you want to save them, let me do this." The shadows closed in as Jacob raised his axe. He looked at Tasha, Noah, and Andrew one last time. "Tell people to leave this glacier alone. Forever." Before anyone could stop him, Jacob plunged the axe into the glowing sigil. The blade sank deep into the ice, and an ear-piercing scream erupted from the corpse. The sigil flared with blinding light, and the shadows froze, their forms trembling. The collapse. The glacier groaned like a dying beast. Cracks splintered across the ice, radiating from the corpse as if the glacier itself were fracturing. Andrew grabbed Tasha and Noah, dragging them away as the ground beneath them began to crumble. "Run," he shouted. Behind them, the glowing body sank into the fissure, Jacob still standing over it. The shadows shrieked and disintegrated into the storm, their forms dissolving like smoke. As the glacier collapsed, a massive plume of snow and ice erupted, swallowing Jacob and the body. The survivors barely made it back to the remnants of the camp. They collapsed, gasping for air, as the storm finally began to subside. The sky above was clear now, revealing the cold, indifferent stars. A quiet aftermath. Hours later, the silence was absolute. Andrew sat by the smoldering remains of a fire, staring at the fissure where Jacob had disappeared. Tasha wrapped a blanket around herself, her face pale and tear-streaked. Noah sat nearby, his hands trembling. "It worked," Tasha whispered. "He stopped it." Andrew nodded, though his expression was hollow. "At what cost?" The three of them stared at the vast, empty expanse of the glacier. It was calm now, eerily still, But deep beneath the ice, something stirred, waiting. The storm had passed, leaving the glacier eerily calm, its vast white expanse illuminated by the cold light of dawn. The camp was in ruins, tents shredded, equipment scattered, and the excavation site swallowed by a jagged fissure that snaked into the horizon. The air felt heavy, as if the glacier were holding its breath, waiting. Andrew, Tasha, and Noah sat huddled around the remnants of a fire they had managed to rekindle. The silence between them was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of shifting ice in the distance. Tasha stared into the fire, her hands trembling as she clutched her notebook. "It's over," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It has to be over." Andrew shook his head. His gaze was fixed on the fissure, its edges crusted with frost. "We don't know that. We don't know anything about what we've unleashed." Noah's voice was barely audible. "Jacob, he didn't have to die." Andrew turned to him, his face etched with exhaustion and anger. "He saved us. If he hadn't acted, none of us would be here right now." Tasha spoke softly, her voice brittle. "He said to leave this place alone. Forever." Signs of recovery. The surviving team scavenged what they could from the wreckage, packing only the essentials for the trek back to civilization. The radio was destroyed, leaving them without any way to call for help. The closest base was a day's journey on foot, and the thought of crossing the glacier again filled them with dread. As they prepared to leave, Tasha lingered at the edge of the fissure. She felt a pull, as though the abyss itself were calling her. She flipped through her notebook, stopping on the page where she had sketched the final sigil. The lines seemed to shimmer faintly in the pale light, as if alive. "Tasha, we need to go," Andrew called. She hesitated, then tore the page from her notebook and folded it into her pocket. Coming. The journey back. The journey across the glacier was grueling. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move unnaturally. The team spoke little, their exhaustion and fear too great. Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper, and the patterns in the snow seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. Once, she swore she saw a figure in the distance, tall and dark, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. But when she blinked, it was gone. Noah grew increasingly paranoid, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. "It's following us," he muttered. "I know it is." Andrew tried to keep them focused. "It's just the wind, Noah. Keep moving." But he didn't believe his own words. He could feel the glacier beneath him, alive and malevolent, waiting for its next chance. The rescue. By nightfall, the team reached the base, a small research outpost perched on the edge of the glacier. The lights of the facility were a welcome sight, but the unease didn't fade. Inside, they were met with concern from the outpost staff, who immediately offered food and warmth. Andrew recounted their ordeal in vague terms, leaving out the supernatural details. "The storm hit us hard," he said. "We lost 2 of our team, Jacob and Emma." The staff exchanged uneasy glances but didn't press further. A rescue helicopter was called, and the survivors were told they'd be flown out at first light. Lingering dread. That night, Tasha couldn't sleep. The warmth of the outpost felt foreign, almost stifling. She sat by a frost-covered window, staring out at the glacier. In the distance, the fissure was barely visible, a dark scar against the white expanse. She pulled the torn page from her pocket, tracing the lines of the sigil with her finger. It felt incomplete, as though something were still missing. A faint whisper drifted to her ears, so quiet she thought she imagined it. "Tasha!" She turned sharply, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, this time from the window. She pressed her face to the glass, her breath fogging the surface. The glacier stared back, vast and indifferent. But for a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow slipping beneath the ice. The morning came, and a helicopter arrived to take them away. As they lifted off, Andrew stared out the window, watching the glacier recede. Relief mingled with guilt as he thought of Jacob and Emma, their lives sacrificed to an ancient curse. Tasha sat beside him, clutching her notebook tightly. "We can't tell anyone," she said suddenly. Andrew turned to her, startled. "What? We can't let anyone come back here." "If they do," she trailed off, her voice breaking. He nodded slowly. "We'll make sure they don't." But as the glacier disappeared from view, a deep crack echoed through the icy expanse, faint but distinct. Andrew's stomach twisted. He knew they hadn't seen the last of it. The glacier remembers. Back at the research station, officials dismissed their claims of strange phenomena, attributing the deaths to the storm. The excavation site was declared unstable and off-limits, but Andrew knew it wouldn't be long before another expedition tried their luck. Weeks later, Tasha returned to her small apartment, unable to shake the lingering dread. She spread her sketches across the table, studying the sigils in obsessive detail. The more she stared, the more the lines seemed to shift, forming patterns she couldn't understand. One night, she awoke to the sound of cracking ice. Her bedroom window was frosted over, despite the warm summer air. In the corner of the room, a tall shadow loomed, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. From deep within the glacier, something had followed them home. Tasha sat frozen in her bed, the shadow in the corner of her room pulsing faintly in the dim moonlight. The glow of its hollow eyes bore into her, paralyzing her with an ancient, primal fear. It didn't move, but the frost on her window crept inward, forming jagged patterns on the glass. "Tasha," the voice was low and guttural, dragging out each syllable like the scraping of metal on ice. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. It's not real. It can't be real. But deep down, she knew. The curse Jacob had sacrificed himself to seal hadn't been stopped. It had only been delayed, and now it was hunting them. The warning. The next morning, Andrew's phone buzzed incessantly. He groggily reached for it, his sleep-deprived mind struggling to process the series of frantic messages from Tasha. "It's here. I saw it. The ice is following me. We were wrong, Andrew. We didn't stop it." He immediately called her back, but it went straight to voicemail. Anxiety gripped him as he replayed her words in his mind. He had been trying to put the events of the glacier behind him, but her messages brought it all crashing back. He still saw Jacob's face in his dreams, heard Emma's screams in the wind. Without hesitation, Andrew grabbed his keys and drove to Tasha's apartment. Tasha's descent. When Andrew arrived, the door to Tasha's apartment was ajar. He pushed it open, stepping into a cold, dark space. The air was unnaturally frigid, his breath visible even indoors. Papers littered the floor, her notebook torn apart and scattered. The walls were covered in hastily scrawled glyphs, some in ink, others in what looked disturbingly like blood. "Tasha!" Andrew called, his voice echoing in the silence. He found her in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, her hands shaking as she scratched another sigil into the wooden floorboards with a knife. "They're coming," she whispered, not looking up. "I tried to stop them, but they're already here." Andrew crouched beside her, gently taking the knife from her trembling hand. "Tasha, listen to me. We'll figure this out, but you have to tell me what's happening." She finally looked at him, her face pale and gaunt. "It wasn't just the glacier, Andrew. It's the cold. It's alive. It follows you, seeps into you. Once you've touched it, you can't escape." Before Andrew could respond, a loud crack echoed through the apartment. The sound was unmistakable, ice fracturing under pressure. Frost began to spread across the windows, and the temperature plummeted further. "They're here," Tasha said, her voice flat. "It's too late." Noah's plight. Miles away, Noah sat in his workshop, tinkering with a broken radio. Since returning from the glacier, he had immersed himself in his work, trying to drown out the memories of what they had seen. But he couldn't escape the cold. His workshop, once a safe haven, had become a freezer. The heater he kept running at all times did nothing to combat the icy chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. As he fiddled with the radio, static crackled to life. He froze, staring at the device as a voice emerged from the noise. "No!" He recoiled, the voice sending shivers down his spine. It was Emma's voice, soft pleading. "Noah, why did you leave me?" The shadows in the corners of the room darkened. elongating into unnatural shapes. He backed away, his breath quickening. No, this isn't real. But the frost spreading across the floor told him otherwise. The gathering. Andrew managed to get Tasha out of the apartment and into his car. She was silent during the drive, staring out the window as if expecting to see something following them. He called Noah, but there was no answer. Panic gnawed at him as he sped toward Noah's workshop. When they arrived, the door was locked and the windows were frosted over. Andrew pounded on the door, shouting Noah's name, but there was no response. Finally, he kicked it open, the door swinging inward to reveal the room engulfed in frost. Noah sat slumped against the far wall, his eyes wide with terror, frozen tears streaking his face. His breath fogged the air in short, shallow gasps. "They're here," he whispered. "They're already inside." The shadows moved. At first, they seemed like tricks of the dim light, but as Andrew and Tasha watched, they coalesced into tall, humanoid shapes. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and the air grew impossibly cold. "Run," Noah rasped, his voice barely audible. "Go." Andrew grabbed Tasha's arm and pulled her out the door, Noah's screams echoing behind them as the shadows closed in. The curse unleashed. Back in Andrew's truck, they sped toward the nearest town, but the frost was relentless. It crept across the windshield, obscuring their view. The radio crackled, Emma's distorted voice mingling with static. "You can't escape," the voice whispered. "You're already ours." Tasha clutched her notebook, her lips moving in silent prayer. Andrew gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "There has to be a way to stop this," he muttered. "There has to be." The frost thickened, and the truck skidded on the icy road. They came to a halt as a figure appeared in the headlights, a tall, dark silhouette with glowing eyes. Andrew and Tasha stared in horror as more figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding the truck. The temperature plummeted further, and the engine sputtered and died. Tasha opened the notebook, frantically flipping through the pages. "There's one more sigil," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's the only way." Andrew turned to her. "What does it do?" Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "It's not to stop them. It's to let them in." The frost-covered figures moved closer, their glowing eyes reflecting in the glass. The frost-covered figures closed in, their hollow eyes glowing faintly through the thickening ice on the truck's windows. Andrew and Tasha sat frozen in terror, the cold seeping into their bones. The air inside the cab was heavy, thick with the oppressive presence of the beings outside. "Tasha," Andrew said, his voice trembling but firm. "You said there's one more sigil. What does it do?" Tasha's hands shook as she clutched her notebook, flipping to the final pages. "It's not to seal them," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's to invite them fully into this world. It will end the curse, but it will bring them here." Andrew's stomach dropped. "And what happens if we don't?" "They'll keep hunting us," she said, her voice barely audible. "And they'll spread. The cold, it'll reach everyone." Outside, the shadows began pressing against the truck, their hollow eyes inches from the frosted glass. The windows groaned under the pressure, spiderweb cracks forming in the ice. "We don't have a choice," Andrew muttered, grabbing the notebook. He studied the sigil, a complex web of spirals and jagged lines. "We do this, or it all ends here." Preparing the sigil, Andrew kicked open the truck door, the freezing air hitting him like a wall. Tasha followed, clutching the notebook as they stumbled onto the icy road. The figures circled them, their glowing eyes fixed, their forms flickering as if struggling to fully materialize. "We need an open space," Andrew shouted over the howling wind. Tasha pointed to a clearing by the roadside, the snow-covered ground eerily flat. They trudged through the snow, the frost biting at their exposed skin. The figures followed, maintaining their distance, but tightening their circle. Andrew knelt in the snow, using the tip of a knife to carve the sigil into the ice. His fingers were numb, trembling as he worked. Tasha stood guard, her breath fogging the air as she held the flashlight steady. "They're getting closer," she said, her voice breaking. "Hurry," Andrew muttered, his movements frantic. The sigil was nearly complete, its intricate design glowing faintly in the icy surface. The ritual begins. The moment the sigil was complete, the air changed. The wind stopped abruptly, and a deafening silence enveloped the clearing. The glowing eyes of the shadow figures flickered, their forms trembling as if caught between two worlds. Tasha opened the notebook, her voice trembling as she began reciting the incantation scrawled beneath the sigil. The words were ancient, guttural, almost painful to speak. The sigil beneath them glowed brighter with each word, casting eerie light on their faces. The figures stopped moving. One by one, they turned their hollow eyes toward the glowing sigil. The frost in the air thickened, the temperature dropping even further. Andrew's breath came in ragged gasps. "Is it working?" Tasha didn't answer. Her voice rose as she reached the final lines of the incantation. The figures stepped closer, their movements no longer jerky, but smooth, deliberate. They seemed to be drawn to the sigil, their forms solidifying with every step. A final sacrifice. When the last word left Tasha's lips, the sigil exploded with light, a blinding blue that illuminated the entire clearing. The figures stopped in their tracks, their forms wavering like smoke caught in a gale. The ground beneath the sigil cracked, a deep fissure forming in the ice. From its depths came an unearthly roar, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very souls. The figures turned toward the fissure, their hollow eyes fixed on it. "It's pulling them back," Andrew shouted, shielding his face from the light. But Tasha shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, it's not enough." The fissure widened, and the roar intensified. The figures began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart and spiraling toward the glowing sigil. But the light began to dim, flickering as if struggling to maintain its hold. Tasha turned to Andrew, her expression resolute. "It needs more." Andrew's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "The sigil," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It needs a life to power it. That's the only way." "No," Andrew said, stepping toward her. "We'll find another way." "There isn't another way," she said, her voice firm. "You have to let me do this." Before he could stop her, Tasha stepped into the center of the sigil. The light flared brighter, and the figures let out a deafening wail as they were pulled fully into the fissure. The ground trembled, cracks spidering outward from the sigil as the fissure began to close. "Tasa!" Andrew shouted, reaching for her. She turned to him, her face serene despite the tears. "Tell them, tell everyone, leave the glacier alone." The light consumed her, and with a final, blinding flash, the sigil collapsed. The fissure sealed shut, and the shadowy figures were gone. The wind died completely, leaving only silence. Aftermath. Andrew fell to his knees, the snow beneath him stained with melted ice. He stared at the spot where Tasha had stood, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The glacier was still now, its surface unmarred. The cold remained, but it felt ordinary. The oppressive presence was gone, leaving only an overwhelming sense of loss. Andrew rose slowly, his body aching as he stumbled back to the truck. The engine sputtered to life, and he drove away, the vast, empty expanse of the glacier shrinking in the rearview mirror. A lingering threat. Months later, Andrew sat alone in his apartment, the notebook lying closed on the table before him. He hadn't opened it since that night, but the sigils haunted his dreams. The whispers had stopped, but the cold remained. No matter how warm the room was, he could never shake the chill. One night, as he stared out the window at the falling snow, he saw it. A shadow, tall and dark, standing at the edge of the street. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, watching. Deep beneath the glacier, something stirred. The curse wasn't gone. It had simply changed.